This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is Theodore Paradise, Chief Policy and Grid Strategy Officer for advanced power line manufacturer CTC Global. Theodore is going to describe the concept behind the macrogrid initiative, which would drive interconnection of the nation's segmented transmission regions and could make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. In Theodore's over 26-year career in energy regulatory and transmission law and policy, he's held executive and legal advisory positions with ISO New England, where, by the way, he wrote most of the organization's transmission planning rules that are still in use today, as well as infrastructure developers Embark and Hexacon, and global legal powerhouse K&L Gates. He joined CTC Global in October 2024. So Theodore, the macrogrid, what is the basic idea of a macrogrid or a national transmission system? And what needs could it meet that are not being met today?
Thanks for having me on, Herman. It's nice to be with you and nice to have this conversation and talk about some of these important issues. So macrogrid essentially is a shorthand for a grid that is more integrated than the one we have today. The power system in the United States is an incredibly complex machine. When I think about it, all interconnected across three big interconnections of the Eastern interconnection, the West, and then Texas. And while those interconnections are all connected to some degree, the grid grew up in a design that put power stations close to where people used electricity. And so if you look at sort of a map of the grid, you'll see that. You'll see the big lines that are around certain power stations connecting to load centers. And over the time, there's been transmission lines that have developed between those points to move power around. So we certainly have the ability to move large amounts of power around the grid. But if you look at some of the indicators that show the efficiencies of that flows, and the wholesale power markets are a great indicator of that, you'll see that whenever power use comes up, whether it's warm or really cold, or there's some power issue with a generator that's tripped offline, prices go up. And those are really just showing the limitations of the grid, how much power it can move from point A to point B. So when people talk about macro grids, they're talking about creating more robust connections across grids, across the interconnections between interconnections, so that you can much more effectively and efficiently use the power that you have today, as opposed to getting up to a certain point of a transmission line and then you're sort of at a wall. Power behind that point can't move past it. And that, again, it has a reliability impact, has a cost benefit impact for consumers, and has economic growth implications.
Right.
We talk a lot about big loads.
We're going to talk about costs and benefits in just a minute, but I want to clarify one thing. So I've heard some people talk about macrogrid concept as a national transmission system. You're describing it. You didn't say the word national. I don't mean to catch you out, Theodore,
Sure.
but you didn't actually say the term national transmission system. What you're saying is that there are regions that are closed off, largely closed off to themselves. And so part of this idea of a macrogrid is just interconnecting regions,
Yeah.
maybe eventually getting to a national system. Is that a better way to think about it, or in your opinion?
I think so. I think, part of the reason that I describe it that way, Herman, is intentional. And that's because I think when you talk about a national transmission system, it's daunting, and you almost stop, listening in some contexts when people present an idea that seems too fantastic or difficult. If you're talking about taking the grid that we have today and improving parts of it so that it works better between the pieces that we already have, I think, mentally people can get their heads around that and say, okay, that sounds doable. And in fact, it is incredibly doable. And we can talk a little bit about the technology that CTC has that impacts that kind of thing in a bit. But it is something that is eminently achievable. And so that's why I tend to go with a phrasing that puts it in sort of something that people can get their hands around.
One thing I've never heard anybody really explain and clearly is interconnecting these regions that aren't yet connected, interregional transmission. Does that require less technical challenges than, let's say, connecting the Western interconnect with the Eastern interconnect, or getting Texas hooked up to somebody else in somewhere in the world?
Yeah, I think, when you talk about, connections across interconnections, um, there are lines between those regions. I'll be wonky for just, maybe 1 minute, if it's okay with you and your listeners,
Yeah.
to just say the difference between those interconnections. I mentioned the West and the East and Texas is they're not synchronized. And all this means, this is really simple. Electricity, if you think about your math class, it's just a wave, and that wave moves at, the 60 cycles. And so everything in the eastern interconnection is moving on a nice wave of 60 cycles, and everything is in that frequency. Same thing in the West, but the waves aren't matched up. And the same thing
Uh,
with Texas. So you'll have what we call HVDC connections between these regions that allows you to move power without having to have the grid synchronized across the same frequency. So it is a little bit more to connect, the different interconnections of the country.
okay.
But within the regions, we talk about interregional transmission, right? Which is the phrase you use, and that's exactly
Mhm.
right. So these regions are connected to some degree, right? There's power that's flowing between ISO New England and New York and PJM and MISO. That's happening today. I think, when you hear ASEG or ACOR or others talk about, macrogrids, we're really talking about improving the ability for the existing power system to move more power past these pinch points around how the grid was built up. So, in the simplest way, to do that in some cases, well, we'll just build more lines. And then there are other ways to do it where we replace lines with things like advanced conductors that can move twice the power. Those things can be done in a matter of months. And so it technically, when you start to get into those sorts of solutions, it is very achievable, and not a daunting sort of undertaking.
But some of those things are going to have costs. So
Yes,
I want to talk a minute here next about the costs and benefits of these
sure.
interregional macrogrid type connections. And I also want to know what barriers that have prevented the development of that kind of interconnected transmission system. I mean, if what are the costs and benefits? I'm guessing that you wouldn't be here today if there weren't more benefits than costs. So if there are more benefits than costs, why hasn't it been done?
Yeah, so it's an interesting sort of story, the U.S. grid, because there's a whole history and context around planning rules and how what those identify and what you need to build to satisfy those rules, and how those either do or don't help bigger transfers of power around the grid. So let's start on just the cost issue when we're talking about improving power transfers across regions or even within regions, because this isn't just within one region to another. It's also within these regions they need
Mm,
transmission improvements. And so uh, Grid Strategies, Rob Gramlich's group did a great paper last year, which just a few days ago, I guess, 2025. But back in the summer last year, it really identified, for every dollar that you spent on grid improvements, is several dollars of benefits back. I think that's
mm,
a little hard for some folks to get their head around. Isn't it just more money? The way the grid worked, and we talked about, the wholesale markets identify these pinch points, is that if you're unable to move power around, then the price goes up as a signal of that because you turn on a more expensive generator that's on the other side of that that limit, right? And so those costs run into many, many billions of additional costs that you could eliminate if you can have transmission that moves the power. So this is one of those cases where you spend $1 to save five kind of situation. So where
Mm,
people like look at the capital costs of reconductoring, for example, with advanced conductors or new lines, you really need to look at what the benefits that comes with that is, or where it's not the whole story. And we see some of that. I mentioned the energy market, but also the capacity market. The capacity markets are forward market indicators. And again, I don't want to be too technical for your listeners, but they're
yeah.
essentially a forward look of supply and demand. And is everything going to match up? And if not, here's a higher price to incentivize it. Well, PJM, which is a major regional transmission organization, has had capacity markets that have cleared over $16 billion in the last few auctions, up from around $2 billion. And the reason for that is there's a lot of load growth, new users of electricity, and there isn't enough supply. But there's more to that.
Let me just, let me just stop you for just
Yeah,
for our listeners' sake. There isn't enough supply to meet for capacity, which is
right.
the energy you need to meet the highest demand points in the day or in the season. And so the PJM may have enough energy to sort of run things in the
Day
morning
to
or
day.
the day and day to day.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. But it has to have energy for those moments when demand is greatest. Demand is going up these days. It's costing PJM and a lot of other grids more to meet that need uh, at those peak periods, right? That's the point. And if you have I think what you're getting to, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. I
yeah.
think what you're getting to is if you have a new transmission line that can bring energy where they have excess, then PJM doesn't have to charge so much, and it's because that capacity is not going to be in short supply. Did I say that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Herman. So that moving power from where we already have it into areas that can use it is one half of it. And then the other part of it is there's a tremendous amount of new supply, new generation, the historical amount, 2.5 terawatts of this, which for your listeners, that's just a lot of energy. And you would think that's great. We have high supply and high demand. So what's the problem? The problem is the transmission system sits between those two things.
Mm,
So new generators and, for example, PJM have years that they have to wait for this new transmission before they can interconnect. They might not bid those megawatts into the capacity market. So the capacity market says, we don't have enough, even though there's generators out there raising their hands saying, well, we're trying to get there. If we could get this transmission done faster, we would put these megawatts into the market, the price would come down. But it's just not there and it's too risky to take a bid on. So you're absolutely right, moving the power, but also new power.
yeah, and to your point, we're recording this, I should tell our listeners, on January 6th. Um, PJM's most recent announcement was that at its absolute highest price that it's allowed to charge for capacity, it couldn't quite get enough to meet its uh, forward needs for what it predicts for the next, I think it's 3 years off, 28.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and that largely is because it's not because the generation isn't there, it's because the transmission to connect that generation isn't there, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's not for a lack of many companies making big investments, to bring new generation on. It's really a function of um, in this country, it takes a long time to do transmission. 10 years or more, 7 years is really fast for a project. And so those timelines are just longer than the supply demand picture. And so it really kind of highlights the point that there's a real, Department of Energy put out an RFI in 2025 about speed to power. And I'm going to get to the first part of your question from before was, why haven't we had more of these sorts of things? we have planning rules, and they require that you make sure that you don't have any issues with voltage or thermal limits or stability. And if you solve that within an area, you satisfy the planning rules. It doesn't say how fast you have to do that. So if it takes 10 or 15 years, that's fine.
Right.
And load growth in this country for a long time was very, very small. That's load growth meaning the amount of additional electric use we're adding. With onshoring, there's a lot of new manufacturing coming back to the US. This is a part that doesn't get talked about. It's
Right.
huge right now. Data centers do get talked about a lot, and that's another part of it. But they're both parts of this big economic growth picture. That's not small and incremental. That's pretty significant. And so having a system that didn't prioritize speed, it's kind of run into sort of the present day, and it kind of breaks essentially.
Okay. Let me move on to a question that goes right with what your last point was.
Yeah,
I read that in the regulatory world, you're known as someone who turns complex energy challenges into actionable, scalable solutions. So tell me, what actionable, scalable ideas do you
sure.
have this is a very complex challenge. What ideas do you have that can move us farther toward this macro grid? And by the way, I think a lot of those might be CTC Global and others technologies that can
Absolutely.
help
So
make
this
that
gets me
happen.
really excited, not, excited in some abstract, but really just genuinely excited because I think we are at a point where we can, instead of 10 years or 7 years, massively increase the capability of the grid in a matter of months. And the way to do that, and what CTC has been focused on for many years, is to take the old transmission lines, and I'll show you this, Herman. Your listeners can't see it, but I'll explain it to them. The old transmission lines have a steel core, and those get warm over time, and that heat causes it to sag because this is why you can make a horseshoe in a blacksmith's office, right? CTC replaced this about 20 some years ago with carbon fiber. Much stronger, much lighter. You can put more aluminum on it. It doesn't sag. And so when you do that, you can use the same towers, the same rights of way. You don't need new siting, and you double the amount of power that you can move across that same right of way. And we've put up 125,000 miles of this around the globe. Over 60% of the power that's going in and out of India's capital, for example, is on our conductors.
I would imagine
Um,
that it goes faster for the same reason that you can go faster on a straight line highway than you can on a curvy highway, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, the timing, when you take away those timing issues of building a new line and being able to just change out what's up there that you drive down the highway and see, right, off to the side of the road, doubling that capacity of the existing grid, we can do that in 8 months, in 10 months, in 12 months. It really is restringing a wire, or in some cases rebuilding structures, but it's no higher or no wider. So that's very, very time efficient as well. So the big idea for the scalable solution is to do a lot of that. UC Berkeley Haas School of Business and Grid Lab did a great report that's in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences as a peer-reviewed article in September 2024 that essentially noted that you could reconductor many, if not most of, the existing rights of way in the US and solve for most of the country's transmission constraint issues, effectively creating this sort of macro grid, but doing it very cost effectively. It's 75% less to reconductor than build a new line.
And could you, Theodore, could you also deploy the sensors that would make grid enhancing technologies available to system operators at the same time that you're doing that reconductoring?
You absolutely can. I mean, these things can go, absolutely together. When we talk about grid enhancing technologies, I think Christina mentioned it, we often talk about dynamic line ratings to try to eke out a few more megawatts of capacity. When we reconductor with an advanced conductor, it's a good start because we're doubling the capacity just right there. And that's 24/7, 365. It's not weather dependent. So it's all the time capacity.
But
Um,
these computer technologies that make what's the sensors on the lines are reading and find faster, more efficient ways to deliver power. They even with reconductoring, they would advance the capabilities of the new lines, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of great tools out there to add that sort of awareness and operational flexibility. It's important to, well, can we just do that? I think is one of the questions that comes up. No, because, a dynamic line rating will tell you that you have more power because it's nice and 60 degrees with a lovely breeze out. But it doesn't work when it's really hot, for example. You might actually have less capacity than you think on the line. So you do need to upgrade the actual physical infrastructure. And so, what CTC does is really focused on that and how to do that very quickly in a speed to power way and a cost effective way. And then what you're saying, Herman, is right. Can you further optimize that? Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, and everybody I've talked to uh, for the last, I don't know, 5 years or more has been talking about doing both to
Hmm.
optimize the system because obviously, I'm not going to go into this in this conversation, Theodore, but we're having problems with this hoped for Speed Act that would have cleared the way for faster permitting and siting. Um, and so we run into that, what you talked about earlier, the long time it takes to build new transmission. So we need to get as much as we can out of the system that we have. If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.